Only a short flight away from the major European capitals, Jordan is bordered by Saudi Arabia, Syria, Palestine, Israel, and Iraq. As the cradle of civilization, the countries of the Middle East are littered with archaeological treasures. Jordan is no exception. Jordan is a living history book. Although Petra is the Jordan's best-known archaeological site, the ancient town of Jerash, formerly known as Gerasa, is equally significant. Founded in the 3rd century AD by the Greeks, it reached its prime under the Romans in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. The Byzantine authorities designated it as a bishop's seat. Faced with the Persian and Arabian invasions of the 7th century and a series of earthquakes, the town was eventually reduced to ruins. Roman Jerash was never to regain its former glory, but today the site is an archaeological gem. At the southern entrance to the town is Hadrian's Arch. It is 25 meters tall and was built in honor of the visit of the Roman Emperor Hadrian in the year 129. What is unusual about this structure is the crown of acanthus leaves sculpted at the top of each of the pillars. The exquisite detailing. Continuing past Hadrian's Gate, we come to the Hippodrome. It was built at the time of the Severan dynasty towards the end of the 2nd century AD. The Hippodrome was equipped with 10 starting gates called carceres, and it could hold 15,000 spectators. It is believed that even during the Roman era, Greek was spoken here during the chariot races. From the carceres starting gates, the 4-horse teams led by the charioteers burst onto the track. The chariot races were a highlight in the cultural life of Roman cities, and betting was common practice amongst the enthusiastic public. The drivers and the horses were local stars. The teams belonged to different stables and bore their colors and divine symbols. Today, the site of Jerash is considered to be one of the best preserved archaeological sites of the Roman Empire. At first, Jerash was one of the 10 towns of the Decapolis. As the name suggests, the group included between 8 and 16 towns according to different ancient writers. It was a group of Hellenistic cities in a Semitic area just on the border of the desert. One of our problems is to try to understand what was the significance of these 10 Hellenistic towns, situated within this zone and grouped together, acting as a remarkably coherent whole. Only one was situated in the west of Jordan, and that was Decapolis. The Decapolis was the fruit of an economic alliance during a period of great opulence. During this prosperous period, Jerash boasted paved streets with colonnades, immense temples, theaters, vast public spaces, fountains, and fortifications complete with towers and grills. It was all carefully planned and laid out. The site of Jerash has always been occupied because it is situated in a relatively rich area in terms of water sources. There is one, for example, right in the middle of the town. Unfortunately, it passes underneath some of the major monuments, and so couldn't be used to supply, for example, the thermal baths, apart from those in the east. But there are also many sources scattered throughout the valley. This explains why the site has always been populated. Starting from the middle of the Bronze Age, a small group settled permanently in what became ancient Jerash. By that I refer to the hill that you see over there, with all the trees, which is now the site of the museum. It is almost entirely artificial. It was just a small hill built up from the accumulation of small villages from the Middle Ages until the present-day museum site. From the Hellenistic and the late Hellenistic periods, the village started to expand and break its boundaries, spreading to the neighboring hillsides. It happened by simple process of progressive diffusion. However, we still know very little about the details of more ancient layers of the town. We only have a few small indicators and probes to go by because, as you can see, the quality of the Roman and Byzantine construction here is such that we cannot dig up existing ruins and destroy the paving in order to study what lies beneath. We are forced to look for sites where there are no important ruins in order to carry out probes. And unfortunately, these are not always the sites which we would most like to study. The oldest dated building in Jerash is the Southern Theater, which you can see beside us, constructed in the year 90, so without a doubt well into the Roman era. We're in the Southern Theater of the town of Jerash. This superb structure was built under the reign of Domitian at the end of the 1st century. Only men were allowed to occupy the first 29 rows of the tiers. Up to 4,000 spectators would enter through the 2 gates. They used tickets made of clay discs. In the front rows, we can still see traces of the Greek letters that were used to designate places. What is incredible here is the quality of the acoustics within the theater. A spectator sitting in the back row of the tiers would have heard equally well as one sitting in the front row. An incredible feat of acoustic engineering. Today, during the summer, the theater hosts the Jerash Festival of Culture and Arts. It's quite a surprise to see Jordanian soldiers playing the bagpipes in the Roman amphitheater in Jerash. In fact, this is evidence of yet another occupation, this time English. In many of the former British protectorates of the Near East, they still play the military music of the Scottish regiments, although the performance style has been somewhat personalized over the years. We're in front of the ramparts and fortifications of the town. Most of the research on the town was carried out in the 1930s by an Anglo-American team led by Crowling. The original idea was that, given that Jerash was so well preserved compared to the other towns of the Decapolis, it could be used as a model to understand more about the organization and the history of the other towns. The organization of Jerash is relatively easy to understand, at least when you look at a map. The town was laid out as a grid with orthogonal axes, suggesting that the town was of Hellenistic origins. The town planning is typically Hellenistic. The town was surrounded by an almost circular rampart. One important point to note is that the wall, of which you can see a section here, contained the city's gates. We can see an example behind us now, built at the time of Emperor Hadrian's visit. According to the Americans, this rampart was built in the 1st century. If the rampart dates from the 1st century, we can infer that the streets were in place in the 1st century, and therefore that the urbanism of the town was already established. This means that more or less all of the organization of the city was set. Several gates have been discovered among the remains of the ramparts, but only the north and south ones are well preserved. The caravans from Arabia would have entered the town through the south gate, with its 3 archways. Here too, there are many clues to the town's history. We have found some installations from the Roman era, some of which are truly remarkable. Here we have an oil press, quite common in the region, but the form of this particular oil press is unusual. It's a direct pressure double screw press. However, the most interesting thing here is the wall itself. As you can see, the rampart partially covers over the equipment of the oil mill. The oil mill would be redundant as it is. Therefore, the building of the rampart must be subsequent to the destruction of the oil mill. And as it happens, we found evidence of the destruction of each stage of the site: the oil mill, the carpenter's stall that was above it, and then of a residential house, with monetary units, ceramic objects, etc. Hence, we proved that the rampart dates not from the 1st century, but from the very end of the 3rd or start of the 4th century, with the typical pattern of the region whereby towns were fortified at the start of the Byzantine era. Despite the lack of written records about the history of Jerash, archaeological research enables us to unravel the tangled web of events. Because here, generation after generation of men have left traces of their existence in the earth and the rock. So this gate was in fact incorporated into the fortifications of the town. That is to say that the rampart was built up around the gate rather than the gate being built into the rampart. And following this discovery, we found a whole series of elements which forced us to re-question the ideas that we had about the town's planning and its history. We can now show that the structure of the town has been superimposed on top of an older, totally different city plan. This knowledge shed doubt on many of our previous assessments. Now we've had to start over with each individual monument to try and retrace little by little the town's history. We've had to go through the process in reverse. Instead of looking at the structure of the town as a whole to draw conclusions about individual elements, we now have to discover the history of the individual elements and build up an image of the town's general history. Unfortunately, we have very few texts on the subject. Luckily, we have one text which provides fundamental information about parts of the history. The text of Flavius Joseph, who wrote about these towns during the First Jewish Revolt. The First Jewish Revolution was an uprising of the Jewish bands of Jews, as they were referred to in the text, came to attack the towns of the interior. The towns of the interior, including Jerash, had Jewish communities who lived among the extremely heterogeneous population. Flavius Joseph writes that the Jewish communities within the towns united with the local population to fight back against the Jewish assailants who descended from Palestine. Flavius Joseph also writes that most of the towns gathered up the local Jewish people and slaughtered them. It's quite clear that only one town withheld from this massacre, and that was Jerash. Not only did Jerash not massacre its Jews at the time of the First Revolt, they even went so far as to protect groups of Jews who nonetheless decided to leave the city for further climes. Obviously, in such a case, the emperor tended to consider his enemies' friends as his enemies. Flavius Joseph tells us that Vespasian came with his troops and razed Jerash. I say razed, they vandalized a number of important symbols, captured people, more or less as slaves. Unsurprisingly, the sanctuary of Zeus, which was the most important sanctuary in the town at the time, was ravaged. What is remarkable, though, is that the sanctuary was rebuilt soon afterwards, more beautiful than ever. We can get an idea of some of the town's history, but this history does not appear to be representative of the other towns of the Decapolis. It's a one-off case, as we see clearly in the case of the First Jewish Revolt, where Jerash alone behaved differently to the other towns, and was no doubt the case during other important events that struck the region. This means that studies of Jerash help us to understand the history of Jerash, insofar as is possible. But they cannot be used as a role model for understanding the history of the other towns, as had been hoped. In the Roman era, from 63 AD, during the conquest of Pompeii, the site passed under direct Roman control, and construction was started on major roads linking Jerash to Philadelphia, Pena, and Bosra. Little by little, the town started to develop. The center of the original settlement disappeared into the new oval plaza, and the town started to spread out over the surrounding hills. The grand bulk of the development wasn't achieved until the first wave of serious construction in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and then again in the Byzantine era. After this, the city suffered in the major earthquake of 749, and simultaneously, or possibly slightly earlier, sadly we cannot tell from the archaeological evidence, a severe plague, or possibly several plagues, i.e. major epidemics, decimated the population, resulting in the start of the decline of the town in the middle of the 8th century. There was a minor Abbasid occupation, then desertification, and then a temporary reoccupation at the time of the Crusades. A small group of people later built a fort with a small village on the slopes. Following this, the population disappeared completely, so that during 7 to 8 centuries, almost a millennium, there was no one present on the site. This means that the site was free from the most evil predator for ruins, man. The town is wonderfully well conserved for this very reason. There was no one around to destroy it. That is why Jerash is one of the most beautiful testaments to our ancient past. The decline and eventual abandonment of the site helps us to understand the ruins. The Greeks destroyed or displaced the traces of the Bronze Age occupation. Then the Romans did the same with the remains left by the Greeks. Then the Byzantines. For archaeologists, the challenge is to get a sense of the order of things. For example, on a site right below the temple itself, Paris's Louvre Museum set up an exhibition of an imaginary reconstruction of a part of the first temple using stones which had been dispersed during the Roman era. Here we have two very important elements. The most significant is no longer visible since the museum installation that was carried out by Paris's Louvre Museum. It is the building itself. We're in the cryptoporticus of the sanctuary of Zeus. Built in 27 to 28 AD by Diodorus, son of Zebedas, a fantastic architect who succeeded here in constructing a set of interconnecting arches without support, segmented archways, which were one of the major difficulties within ancient architecture. Nobody realized it, but what you are seeing here was a major technical achievement. The second element here is the building that was destroyed during the first Jewish revolt. What is extraordinary is that we have recovered about 80% of its blocks, which shows that they were voluntarily taken down and buried. As well as these remarkable buildings, there was the actual town of Jerash. The architects of the day designed the town according to plans which had already been tried and tested in other ancient towns. When you look at a site like Jerash today, you see a fossilized whole. You see the final state of the town after a series of modifications. Looking at the town map, you can see the main road running north-south, with a series of smaller roads cutting across at right angles at regular distances. The town was planned as a grid, as was typical during the Hellenistic era. On the Cardo Maximus, a route lined with the most elegant buildings of Jerash, is the Nymphaeum, a sacred fountain built in 191 AD. It's a two-story structure. In the beginning, it was all mounted on a demi-dome. Its existence and its monumental proportions testify to the opulence of Jerash. It was dedicated to Tyche, the goddess of chance. The building was covered with slabs of marble on the lower level and stucco on the upper level. A grand water feature cascaded down in the middle of the Corinthian columns into a large basin, then ran into various pools, and trickled out down a network of drains which ran the length of the Cardo. But recapturing the past is not always so simple. When the Americans arrived here, the streets were not visible. Here, for example, there was an enormous wheat field. They saw very little of what we see today, so they had to work from maps. The map seems to suggest that the town is of Hellenistic origins. The first probes and discoveries appear to confirm this notion. When you first arrive here, there appears to be no reason to doubt the Americans' conclusions. Their evidence is coherent and makes logical sense. The excavations beside the south gate spread the first seeds of doubt. The existence of a burned ruin dating from the end of the 3rd century underneath the town rampart proved clearly that the rampart is not 1st century. If the ramparts are not 1st century, then we can't be sure about the gates, nor the axes, etc. This detail forced us to re-question everything. What is extraordinary when you look at the 4 columns marking the entrance to the Macellum is that one pair is of a different height to the other. The 2 northern columns are 20 centimeters shorter, which meant that they had to add a prop under the architraves, because the horizontal lines are aesthetically very important. If the horizontal lines were crooked, you would notice it immediately. The height itself was not a problem, but given that 20 centimeters were missing, the architraves had to be propped up. One side is 20 centimeters shorter than the other. The one standing is the strangest because it has 3 sides, the successive surfaces before the external molding. It's a 3-sided architrave on the left side, which is normal, but on the right it has 4 sides. The next one there has its 2 props. It was found on the ground. It's the one which was originally on top, and to get it horizontal, they had used a double prop. Here we have a 4-sided architrave, which is totally abnormal, but it's just a cover-up, typical of a building built by people who didn't always measure every individual centimeter as we do today. That said, there are still people today who aren't perfectly precise, far from it, and that's no bad thing. If you turn around, you can see some columns. They are perfectly in place. They haven't been restored. Those columns were constructed in the second half of the 2nd century. A little further on, you see the same columns, but the vertical mounts are recycled from older columns. If you continue even further, you have more of the same columns, but using entirely recycled material and rebuilt in the 5th or 6th century. You always have to look closely, otherwise you can mistakenly conclude that the street was built in the 2nd century, which is what everyone will tell you. We weren't present at the moment of construction, nor when the town developed. We only see the final modified state, which generally dates from the Byzantine era. The most important thing is to bring together all of the contradicting evidence. For example, during the excavations of those houses beside us, they dug under the street and came across the wells of a number of Roman houses which were filled in 170 AD to make way for the street we see today. This proves that the street cannot be older than the second half of the 2nd century AD. It's the actual positioning of the street, not simply a question of resurfacing or reconstructing the columns. The street itself cannot have existed prior to the end of the 2nd century. In the same way, the beautiful pavement that you see running the length of the street was built using materials from the sanctuary of Zeus, so not before the end of the 5th century, although the columns behind it date from the 2nd century. So as you can see, it's a big mix. What is extraordinary is that we can see that in the 5th century, materials are taken from the higher parts of the building to be used in a Byzantine construction, and 1 century later, the moldings of the foundations are recycled in the triumphal artwork of one of the churches. But how are we to know? Nothing remains on the site. Everything has been removed, and we are left with the broken remains, fragments of the capitals, bits of molding, etc. And when we start the reconstructions, we look for the connections, and we start to piece together the web. The Temple of Zeus is a prime example of the challenges that archaeologists face in reconstructing the past. The site is littered with pillars, stones, capitals, and collapsed architraves, evidence of passing of the generations and of the violent earthquakes and wars that the town suffered. The work of the archaeologists lies in reconstructing the historical puzzle of this forgotten town. We are in the sanctuary of Zeus. It's a sanctuary built on several levels. We are currently on the podium, part of the facade of the Grand Temple, which was consecrated in 162 AD. This temple was constructed adjacent to an older structure, which remains underneath, known as the lower terrace because of its position below the Grand Temple. This lower terrace is, in fact, the primitive core of the sanctuary. And so, standing on this terrace, we can look back over more than 2,000 years of history. Here we discovered a really extraordinary construction, predating the construction of the temple we're standing in. There is a series of different buildings built at different moments stretching over a period of more than a millennium. Here, these structures do not conform at all to the classical canons of 2nd century architecture. We refer to this style as Oriental for lack of a better word, because these are elements of the later Hellenistic tradition. It's all a bit unclear. In the middle of the courtyard stood the most important element of the sanctuary, the temple itself. The inscriptions tell us that more than a dozen divinities were worshipped in the town. But only the remains of the sanctuaries to Olympian Zeus and Artemis, his daughter, are still visible today. The ruins of the monuments to Zeus and Artemis have always impressed visitors, but our real interest is in understanding the chronology of their development, which is linked to transport networks, urban expansion, and the history of the city. The excavations have shown that at the time the two temples were in competition with one another. The most important sanctuary which prevailed in the hearts of the residents of Jerash was the sanctuary of Zeus. The temple of Artemis remained unfinished, despite the fact that 12 years later, they started and completed the building of a massive temple, larger than that of Artemis. Archaeology tends to deal with large monuments. Occasionally, we have texts which are highly detailed, but we almost never have access to the information that most interests us. For example, we'd love to have a text which explained to us, "It was I, Emperor X, who financed the construction of the Temple of Artemis, because I wished to demonstrate that the imperial power was absolute in Jerash." But we'll never have that. The situation is complicated by the fact that building materials from the deserted temples were later used to build new monuments in the town. We are once again in front of a portico, which seems to be of good quality, with the pavement in front which has been rebuilt, projecting out into the street, again entirely using blocks from the sanctuary of Zeus. You can see clearly the blocks of white limestone, the little palm-shaped cornice there, as well as blocks from an ornamental altar, which once stood in the courtyard of the sanctuary. All of that was demounted and reused here, as well as in the St. Theodore Cathedral and the thermal baths, etc. Nothing is left of the sanctuary, and so our task today is to try and discover its various parts scattered around the town. We're helped by the fact that we know to look only in buildings dating from after 450, because excavations show that the demolition of the building started in 450 AD. So we look in all buildings of the town built after 450. Sometimes blocks are relatively easy to find, and sometimes it's more complicated. For example, the Italian group excavating further down from here recently found 19 architraves all together. They'd been used in the portico of a church. We're standing under the portico, in the atrium leading up to the Propylaeum church, which is behind us. And underneath the bases of the columns you see here are a series of blocks. The architraves of the Naus of Zeus, which disappeared from the sanctuary of Zeus. They have all been recycled to make up the foundations of the portico of the Byzantine church. You can see one here and another over there on top of the door. These blocks are easy to spot because they are very particular. They are the only ones made of pink limestone with a molding and very specific dimensions. And above all, we can see these dovetail tenons, or clamps. These have recently been excavated by the Italians, and so we have 19 more blocks of the sanctuary which have suddenly come to light. The other major temple is the Temple of Artemis, a Roman temple built in 150 AD under the reign of Antoninus the Pious. The portico of the building consisted of 12 Corinthian columns. They are so tall that on a windy day you can see the pillars swaying. 11 of them are still standing. This is no doubt the city's most important monument, partly because of its significance as the temple to the patron goddess of Jerash, but also because of its proportions. The whole construction spreads over almost 650 meters. This is the entry to the sanctuary of Artemis. This street is the Cardo, the famous north-south axis road, and we are at the foot of the Propylaeum, the gate which leads up to the sanctuary. The sanctuary of Artemis is a very ordinary sanctuary. There are no great surprises. It's a large 2nd century structure. You won't find any unusual capitals or moldings here. This is a classical architecture in its full splendor. However, one thing which is remarkable is the use of the topography and how the different spaces are set in a progressive perspective. We are currently in the area surrounding the sanctuary, which was built up on the hill. It is invisible from here, although here we are already in the middle of the site, which extended all the way to the swamps on the other side of the wadi. There was a street, a bridge, a first gate onto the street, followed by a section of road, then a narrowing as you pass through another monumental gate, and then a trapezoid-shaped plaza giving onto the Cardo, where we're standing now. The overall structure was based on a progressive enlargement, and as you can see, the effect is increasingly strong. Here we're at the foot of the Propylaeum, and you can see the Tripylon behind us, and behind that a staircase which is only 34 meters wide. The staircase led to an intermediary terrace. It's a progressive build-up with a gradual expansion spreading out in front of the facade of the sanctuary. The composition is extraordinary, as you'll see when we get to the summit. Although dedications to the goddess make reference to a place of worship dedicated to her in the middle of the 1st century AD, these current structures only date from the middle of the 2nd century. Here you can see some freestanding columns. It's a colonnade, not a portico, meaning that the columns were purely decorative rather than structural. In terms of its decoration, the sanctuary of Artemis is truly extraordinary. First, the tripylon, the three monumental doors which we're now passing through. You have to imagine that there were ventails, doors which could be closed or opened at will. Behind that was the first series of steps, separated by small landings, which lead up to the first terrace with, we believe, an altar. I say we believe because there is still major discussion as to whether the altar was part of the staircase or something else. From here you start to get a glimpse of the columns of the sanctuary, columns of the temple itself. The Temple of Artemis was intended to be the most beautiful and the most important temple in ancient Jerash. It contained panels of fine marble and a beautifully decorated cult statue in the cella. Only the best sufficed when honoring the town's patron. In fact, this vision is deceptive, because you would not have had this view at the time. When you arrived on the intermediary terrace, you would have been faced by a staircase more than 100 meters wide, apparently blocked in by two large towers, and between these two, another colonnade, behind which stood a large wall which hid everything from view, and probably a tripylon with three large doors. Up to this point, you would still not have seen the temple. You really have to try to imagine that on arrival, you would be faced with something 3 times wider than what you see now. With a rise of more than 40 meters between the lowest and the highest point, this was a stunning architectural backdrop for the playing out of a symbolic and mystical journey. Processions would start at the river and travel up to the Temenos. Now we're arriving at the summit. Our vision of it today is not at all what it would have been. Here you should see a series of columns, which have now disappeared. The only ones left standing are over there on the left-hand side. In front of us, you can see 3 blocks. These are the remains of the threshold of the original doorway. You have to imagine an enormous wall hiding everything. You can't see any of it, unless obviously the door was open. Otherwise, the wall hid everything. One has to be wary of the impressions that you get when you visit sites, partly because elements have disappeared, and also because elements have been added to the site in later years and do not correspond to anything which dates from the ancient era. We are now in front of the Temple of Artemis, which was the major temple of the town, and which from the 2nd century onwards became the principal sanctuary. The temple was built within the sanctuary, a typical classical sanctuary, with a large courtyard surrounded by columns, with the chamber of the god, for example the temple itself, in the middle. This temple is very typical of the 2nd century. It has a podium, a massive foundation on top of which was a series of columns surrounding a central box. What is unusual here is that the podium was hollow. It contains a series of underground rooms. We don't know yet what their purpose was. There are many plausible suggestions, bearing in mind that the access to the rooms was uniquely from the Editon, the raised platform at the end of the cella, the most sacred part of the temple. The other special feature of the temple is the staircase in the Editon leading to the roof. Given that the priest alone had access, we can infer that, like in Palmyre in Lebanon and other such sites, some activities took place on the roof. This indicates that the roofs were probably flat, despite the existence in places of pediments, which would be more typical of sloping roofs. The pediments were false, much as in Palmyre, where we know that there were pediments with flat roofs behind, and even the cella, which was raised up higher. The temple is beautiful. The capitals, as you can see, are absolutely magnificent. They're amongst the most beautiful existing 2nd century capitals, and the reason is simple. Nothing was ever placed on top of them. I mean to say that the building was never finished. There should be architraves, a pediment, etc., but none of these existed because the building was abandoned halfway through, with only the temporary roofing in place. A series of columns lay ready to be mounted. You can see the shafts on the ground alongside others which were left unworked, stone fresh from the mine. Over there you see one of the shafts. The others have been found. We found the mine on the Sulphur Road. The shafts had remained there. They were never even brought to the site. The project was obviously interrupted. We can see clearly that the temple was built directly onto the rock. The rock shows traces of excavations dating from various different eras. There are hydraulic installations to go with the baths which were added when the temple started to be used. But they also intersect with a series of graves which were cut into the rock. Here, for example, there was a funeral chamber, and another one there, and another behind that on this side. Others have been filled in for a number of years. It's clear that we are on the site of an acropolis that was desecrated to construct the sanctuary. And we can see that for certain parts of the foundations, you have to go and search for the rocks where you find them, which is at the bottom of the tomb. Later on, all this was leveled out, and then pipes were run over the top, either to feed or to empty the baths which were used in the construction of the temple. The sanctuary had several large baths like many other sanctuaries in the area. When you look upon this tableau of stones and monuments, you tend to forget the techniques and the human investment which went into creating it. This was the era of the stone industry. By looking at relics and customs, archaeologists have been able to reconstruct a machine which would have been used during the construction of the site of Jerash. I'd like to show you the little monster. During the excavations, researchers came across the remains of a machine which corresponded to descriptions in archive documents, and the discovery amazed them. The technologies being used here were very advanced for the period.
ممنوع.
We're standing in front of a reconstruction of the oldest known machine in the world, a hydraulic saw used for cutting hard stone. It's a truly extraordinary machine. At first glance, it looks like a monster, but it's the prototype of all future mechanical development, because it allows continuous circular movement to be translated into alternative longitudinal movement. It's the basis of mechanics, with a motor which uses hydraulic and not muscular power. It works, obviously, by means of a crank and connecting rod. This was thought to be a European or Chinese discovery from the 14th century, but here we are at the middle of the 6th century AD. And a machine exists in Jerash that can cut up to 8 slabs of hard limestone in one go. And we have proof that the machine worked in the traces left in the blocks that you can see here. It was very sophisticated. One of the branches of the main aqueduct of the town, in fact this one, has been conserved, fed into the enormous tank over there, which today is totally in ruins. The tank provided water for the fountains which we saw in the street, and the overflow from that tank fed into the smaller bath at the back over there, from where water fell 4 meters onto a turning wheel. This type of wheel, fed from above, requires very little water, but produces a great deal of power, in this case roughly 2 tons of power. The water was finally evacuated into the canal and then flowed into the main drains. We are extraordinarily lucky here in Jerash because the supports for the wheel were made of stone. And at the 2 ends of the short axis are plaques on which you have the centric axis, which is fixed metal piece. This centric axis rubbed against the walls, leaving traces, which remain as proof to this day. We know very well that it was a short axis and that things were attached to the 2 ends with the 2 column shafts. An American photo was found which shows the 2 column shafts in exactly the same position as the blocks, which have been restored today. Looking at the blocks here, we know that each saw had 4 blades. We found all the necessary elements, the distances, the hubs, the width of the wheel and height from which the water fell. Everything was there. At Efes, the Austrians excavated a sawing machine, but they couldn't understand how it worked, so they didn't publish anything. That was more than 20 years ago, but I was invited to Efes, where I was able to visit and talk to the Austrians. There's also a second machine showing that this was no question of trial and error. It shows that although we look for themes in the research lines, the one thing an archaeologist really needs is to keep one section of his brain empty, to be sensitive to any detail anywhere, because you never know what you're going to find. And I tell you, during 20 years I passed right in front of it, and for the moment it is still the most important discovery, the one which has caused the most sensation. The site of Jerash in Jordan is a great example of the ups and downs of archaeological research. A wealth of mysterious clues which we piece together to form an intelligible historical account. A great deal of knowledge combined with a little good luck. Jerash has revealed some of its secrets, but not all. There is still much debate about the details of the evidence found here. But the fact remains that almost 2,000 years ago, Jerash was one of the most prosperous places on the earth, flushed with the innocence of success. The people of this area were extremely inventive and very pragmatic. The decor was not fixed as in the Greco-Roman world with standard decorative styles and architectural rules. They noticed things that existed here and there and played with ideas. You might say that the style was already quite Baroque, with things being done in unusual ways. And it's fantastic because we're always discovering amusing things.